It's good to be in Ljubljana again. I've only been here twice. Once in 1979 was a lovely visit, but only a brief one, a pit stop on the way to Korčula. And the second one was in 1991, which was a fascinating visit, but it was a harrowing one because Slovenia was at war at the time, and we heard lots of harrowing stories. So I'm hoping this visit will be as lovely as the first one, but much more peaceful than the second one. And I'm really happy to have been invited here, so thank you to Focus and Boštjan and the organizers for inviting me to speak to you and discuss with you. And the organization was just fantastically well done. It's all been very, very smooth. I always try to travel by train. We're traveling by rail on the way home, but unfortunately we had to travel by plane here. We departed from Heathrow. I wish I could have departed from Gatwick Airport, another major London airport, because it is now carbon neutral. They've invented a way whereby planes can fly by magic. This is literally the signs you see all over Gatwick Airport, and they're meant seriously. These are, Gatwick Airport really believes it is carbon neutral. This is a sign of how completely messed up our times are. I asked Boštjan, or one of the other organizers, what topic should I speak on at this summer school? And they replied, this is the first lecture, so I should try and cover basic points, address broad, fairly general questions. I'm a little worried this is going to be too general, but I'm going to try to do that, cover some general points concerning the overarching topic of this summer school, which is green transition. Now, the green transition is often talked about in the singular, the transition. The image we have is of human society around the world waking up to the damage that we've all been doing to the natural environment. And we realize that we have to change course, change policies, practices, individual behaviors, to remedy what we have been doing. Of course, we all know it's more complex than that. There are thousands of, the green transition, but there are thousands of shades of green. I've heard that there are around 300 different ones. I mean, look at this. My eye was drawn to this one here, British racing green. Is it even green? I must admit I'm a little colorblind, red-green colorblind. Maybe this explains my red-green politics. I don't really see the difference between them. Anyway, I'm a bit colorblind. That looks brown to me. Britain anyway, is the country I live in, I come from. Its governments have long been crowing that Britain has been cutting its carbon emissions per capita for many, many years. We lead the world, they say. But this is largely because back in the 1980s, the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher was determined to crush the labor movement, and the strongest bastion of working class power were the coal miners. So this wonderful ecological achievement, part of the green transition, is really driven in Britain's case by capital's determination to crush the working class. And so we need to always be a little wary when we're told that the pace of green transition can be measured by the decline in carbon emissions, because there are many, many reasons why hydrocarbon use can fall. It can fall for cost reasons. Energy security is an important one, of course, or economic collapse, if you think of Eastern Europe after 1989. So there are many shades of green transition. Green transition is political. It's a contest among competing values, strategies, policies, and so on. What does green mean here? There's a contestation over how to define the environmental crisis. Now, within that field of contest, the dominant mainstream position, at least in Europe, is we could call it sort of green liberalism, geared around strategies of eco-modernization. And seeing as we are in the European Union at an EU-funded summer school, I want to take throughout this lecture as an example the approach of the European Union Commission in this slide here. So if you see how the EU Commission defines the green transition, you can see that really they get what is at stake. They really do. Why is a green transition urgently needed? They understand this because if you read what they say climate change, etc., are an existential threat to the EU, and perhaps even worse, to the world. And so on this point, the Commission is in line with what the scientists are telling us, because what are the scientists telling us? That, we're heading towards very probable 3 degrees warming. Even the neoliberal rag called The Economist recognizes that this would be truly disastrous. The atmosphere now contains more carbon dioxide than at any time, I think, I'm not a natural scientist, but I think any time in the last 14 million years. That's a long time. That's so long ago that our evolutionary branch, the great apes, they were only just beginning to speciate. They had only very recently diverged from the ancestors of these cutie little darlings, who, by the way, we are about to drive to extinction, because apart from these two in the photo, there are only a couple of dozen left of them. So we're currently on around 1.3 degrees above the pre-industrial level, and if you map the previous, if you map the scenarios that the IPCC have drawn up, you can see that the dotted line is the one that we're actually following. The others are those that the models predict according to certain various pathways. And we're pretty close to following the worst case predictions, the RCP 8.5. We're not far from that. And if we keep following that line, that's a big if, but it's keeping following the line is a definite possibility. Then it would be very likely we're heading to 4 degrees by the end of the century, which would unleash, by then, very powerful nonlinear developments. You're probably aware, I'm sure, of feedbacks, tipping points that would propel the planet towards a hothouse state. So as depicted here, the climate has moved between glacial and interglacial periods, ice ages and interglacials, for a very, very long time throughout the Holocene, but now we're moving to a state where, unless we take very radical action towards a stabilized Earth, it will power forward towards a hothouse state. If we do get to 4 degrees, that would bring not only rising seas and the floods that the previous speaker was mentioning in Slovenia, much worse and worse, and the droughts, but also the possibility of causing a worldwide loss of cloud cover, which would escalate global heating dramatically, perhaps by another 8 degrees, making 12 degrees in all. Now, this theory is debated. It may not happen, but even if 4 degrees is exceeded, it may not catapult us forward to 12 degrees. But if it did, at 12 degrees, we and most other species would be toast, in fact, long before that. Even the General Secretary of the United Nations is talking in these terms. This quote is from his speech at the Biodiversity COP15. The point is that as we wipe out other species, we are sawing off the branch on which we sit. I'm sure many of you share the just incredulity at this prospect. I mean, imagine if an alien came to our planet, how puzzled they would be. The General Secretary of the United Nations, they would see, the closest thing that this strange society of Homo sapiens have to a leader. He is warning that if we keep on like this, we'll wipe ourselves out, and we'll wipe out most other species, and yet most people seem to be going on as normal. The United Nations itself presides over meeting after meeting, plotted here on the graph, but the emissions keep on rising. In fact, they are accelerating. These are the graphs for the major 3 global heating gases, apart from water vapor. And you can see CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing. accelerating, the increase is accelerating. I mean, what we want to see is the bars going below the x-axis, that as it does for 1 year for methane. That's the only case where emissions are actually going down. What these graphs are really showing is that, by and large, they're accelerating, certainly for CO2. So we can be very happy then that the European Union Commission recognizes the problem that the world, they say, faces an existential threat, they say. What does it propose to do about it? Well, it has developed a Green Deal, as you know, which focuses on making transport and industry sustainable in order to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. So transport and industry are mentioned. There's no mention here of questions of diet and livestock agriculture, which are very important, I think, too. In the policy detail of the Green Deal, you can find some commitment to slightly reducing greenhouse gas emissions from pig and poultry farming, but there's virtually nothing that I've seen anyway on cattle, and that's the big one. I mean, look at the amount of space in the United States. From this cartogram, you can see that cattle agriculture takes up, because you need to include livestock feed as well, and the European Union figures are less clear, but still enormous areas taken up by the production of meat, this extraordinary industry that is too little talked about in this context, I think, but has led to an astonishing change in just the sheer weight of animal life around the world. Wild animals used to dominate the world, and now they're really like a species in zoos, so utterly outweighed by the livestock. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. I want to move back to the main line of argument about the Green Deal. So if you look at the Green Deal, climate neutrality is the focus here, which means a net zero economy, achieving a net zero economy. How do we do this via the Green Deal? Well, essentially through efficiency gains and through new technologies. This strategy really is we could call it the efficiency technology paradigm. How does it work? New technologies are introduced. These lead to declining emissions intensity and ultimately a decoupling of emissions and growth. So economic growth can continue, but decoupled from greenhouse gas emissions. I'm very skeptical of this. I think there are very powerful reasons for a skeptical attitude to this strategy. For several reasons. I'm not going to go through them in detail. We can discuss them if you like. One is that, in a sense, efficiency savings are always greenwash, really. Why? Because any capitalist firm is driven to make efficiency savings regardless of climate goals. So, a firm like Tesco, a big supermarket, it was accused of splashing the greenwash around, but its CEO at the time hit back, said, look, we are always getting greener because, there are just business reasons for reducing energy consumption. It's cheaper, and so on. Tesco's green is British racing green, if you like. It makes you make more money by being green if efficiency is your benchmark for environmentalism. And in any case, when Tesco make more money from being so very green, what do they do with it? Here we get on to the question of rebound effects. This idea that is most associated with the English neoclassical economist Jevons, whereby he pointed out he was fascinated by, he was a colonialist and interested in, worried about British imperial decline, and he believed British power was based on the coal, on its coal resources, and he was worried, therefore, that coal might run out. And associates and friends were reassuring him, saying, you know, efficiency will solve that problem. We'll design better technologies to use coal more efficiently. And he replied, well, yes, we will, but that will cheapen the goods produced, so consumers will consume more of them, so overall there'll be higher and higher demand. And we see this throughout the world economy. We see this in cars, for example. You know, cars have become a bit more efficient. They're still pretty inefficient in terms of energy required to propel people around the place, but compared to trains, for example, they're still quite energy inefficient, but efficiency has improved. But that means there's more money for consumers to be, and the car corporations push out new products that are bigger and more glamorous and heavier, therefore, with more gadgets and so on. These are just the small cars, comparing some of the older versions, like the one in which my parents drove me to Ljubljana back in 1979, with their modern-day equivalents. Even small cars, some of them are almost twice the weight of their predecessors, the minis up there. That's even before we get started on SUVs and the way in which they're taking over the world car market. I think I'd like to make the deeper point, though, about efficiency, which is that in a capitalist system, efficiency is defined by the use of minimum inputs to achieve a maximum of output. But the trick is here that inputs are taken to include time and energy, these diffuse concepts, which in our economy boil down to money. And when efficiency starts really being charted and governed by monetary measures, then the results are like this one. Here's an example of what I'm trying to, the point I'm trying to make. The cod industry. Cod, a fish, they swim thousands of miles to spawn in the waters off Norway, between Norway and Shetland and so on. But this is a tiny journey in comparison to the journey that their dead bodies make afterwards. They are then caught, and they're then put in planes and sent to China to be filleted before being returned to supermarkets in Scandinavia, where they are sold. Now, this is an example of efficiency in capitalist terms, because labor in China is cheap. The organization of the fish filleting business in China is very efficient. It makes a lot of money. It makes more money than paying people in Scandinavia to do it. And so the overall system is deemed highly efficient. But and there's the powerful, the mechanisms of the capitalist market determine that efficiency is thought of and practiced in this way. This is just an example of the mechanisms preventing meaningful action to address the environmental emergency. So as we see, the more efficiency savings are made, the higher GDP grows, economic growth increases, but the material footprint, the amount of resources that the world extracts from the natural, that human society extracts from the natural world and turns into products, those resources climb in parallel. And the more that everyday normal technological progress fails to reduce emissions and other environmental harms, the stronger the determination or the hope that we can find speculative, cutting-edge technologies that will solve problems for us. That under discussion in the last 10 years have been ways of sequestering carbon, such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture, And further down the line, there'll be more and more talk of geoengineering, we can be sure of. BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, is a great case in point, because back at the time of the Paris Agreement, which you've all heard of, I'm sure, BECCS was seen as the wonder tech, the new tech that would solve that would enable 1.5 to be achieved, a 1.5 degrees rise above pre-industrial levels, which we're going to smash through now. Because the Paris Agreement was built on this idea. This idea was written into the Paris Agreement, but it was quicksand. Today, it's increasingly apparent that BECCS is unviable at scale. So the Paris Agreement, it really is in technological tatters. You know, there's all sorts of problems with BECCS I won't go into in detail. It basically involves covering large expanses of the world. You'd have to cover an area about the size of Australia or the collection of these European countries. You would have to chop down, you would be planting lots of forest, which then gets regularly chopped down, which is foregone sequestration. The process of manufacturing all this woodland, plantation forestry, would be highly fertilizer intensive, which produces its own forms of greenhouse gas emissions through nitrous oxide and so on, plus all the transport and processing, and some carbon would leak. So yeah, there's something desperate about these gambles on technology, I would suggest. And I think they reflect a deep character of capitalist society, which is its technology fetishism. This derives from the fact that in capitalism, technology becomes more and more alienated from the workers who are producing it. It becomes more and more owned by the capitalist firms, which tend to therefore perceive it as entirely their property, whereby technologies then become conceived of widely as somehow independent from social relations and like gadgets that can just be invented by the boffins and plugged in to solve certain problems. Given that investments in technology are essential often to successful, to profitable accumulation there, we see a tendency to regard technology as the elixir of market success, the elixir of growth. And yeah, so technology fetishism is increasingly governing the way in which climate solutions are understood. And the absurdity of it was revealed, I think, in this quote from America's climate ambassador, John Kerry, a few years ago, where he says, you know, half of emissions will come from technologies we don't yet have. I mean, it's like there's a broad conflagration going on, and you reassure the public, well, we don't have many fire engines, but, you know, half of them will be built and come along at some point. It's very fascinating insight into the sort of irrationalities of these ostensibly rational people. And technology revolutions, again, through the rebound effects, they often lead to energy saving per item, like computers get smaller, etc. But the energy use in the aggregate tends to rise. I mean, look at AI, for example, the exciting new technology of our times. It's energy guzzling to an extraordinary degree. It'll be one of the reasons why the more and more, despite more and more build out of renewable energies, there'll be still very high demand for hydrocarbons. So I'd like to turn from these thoughts to questions of climate delayism and capitalist society. I think in this form of society, in this form of economic system, there is a contradiction between the short-term interests of particular capitals and the long-term interests of capital accumulation. And I think it's helpful to understand climate delayism as in these terms, as the sort of tussle between those economic actors and state managers who seek to look to the long-term interests of capitalist society versus the plurality of firms and states in competitive relations with one another who are, who are governed by, above all, the profit motive. To some degree, those long-term interests are better represented by liberalism, the short-term interests by conservatism, perhaps. Liberals are more sympathetic to global governance, but both are united in defense of the foundations of capitalist order, which are a steep hierarchy of power, exploitation, social polarization. Today, 2,000 billionaires own the same wealth as about a half the world's population, billions and billions of people anyway. I forget the exact figure. It might be 40%, it might be 50%. And above all of those foundations of our society, central to them all is the drive to accumulate capital, together with, at the ideological level, the growth paradigm, the ideology of economic growth. And therefore, liberals looking to a green transition have to construct a kind of utopia of green accumulation, and then they blame climate delay on the conservative backlash, even though the backlash derives its support from all the structures and ideologies that are central to the liberal project too, above all, individualism and avarice. Agreed. Because if you look at the libertarian branch of the backlash, over the green transition recently, but also a few years ago over COVID, in quite similar ways, the policies being advanced by the mainstream green liberal agenda, the net zero policies, to libertarians and conservatives, they represent an infringement on constitutional freedoms. The planet, they say, can go fry before we will relinquish our God-given right to drive our SUVs, drive our big pickup trucks, take flights all the time. Got to hold my hand up a little bit there, and so on. Because money is our private property, we do with it what we please, and to hell with everyone else and every other species. Our money or our farmland is our private property to do with as we please. So in this sense, the backlash is very bourgeois in its form because it's framed as a question of personal liberty versus the tyranny of government. And also, in its seeming resistance to the elites, the liberal elites, it also derives energies from some very toxic core features of bourgeois society. The hierarchy of power, social polarization, and all the resentments and insecurities that breeds. The alienation people have from one another, from human society itself, and above all, the alienation they feel from the natural world. Now, the response of liberalism to the conservative backlash involves avoiding tackling any of those issues. Instead, the tendency is to compromise with the conservatives, to postpone policy reforms, to dilute them, to ensure that which ensures in the long run that these environmental crises get worse and worse, which will ultimately lead to counterproductive, desperate gambles on geoengineering and such like. In the liberal green account, it excludes all questions of capitalism and its power relations and its ideologies from the debate. Or at the very most, it picks up on quite particular points, for example, vested interests, the oil corporations and so on, which is obviously true enough as far as it goes, but is very limited in its explanatory power. And when explaining the delays that are taking place to the green transition in general, mainstream analysis, it relies on a variety of different tropes. One is to point the finger at the demos. It's our fault. We all collectively are guilty of climate delay. It's our egotism that's getting in the way of the change that is needed, which, if you're in the green liberal camp, this makes sense because you believe that liberal democracy is really a genuine, thoroughgoing democracy, that societies are governed by the people who vote. But this occludes completely the colossal fact that the world materially, almost in its entirety, is owned by capitals and by states, which are systemically suborned to capital, all of which exist in competitive interrelations. Another way of looking at climate delay in the mainstream is to point to so-called collective action problems, which is really a way of avoiding talking about capitalism and power through reference to an abstraction. And another is to identify climate change as a wicked problem. A wicked problem is a problem with these features. And it's often said that climate change is a wicked problem in these ways. But without going into it in too much detail, I'm very skeptical of these. I think there can be a pretty clearly agreed definition and a solution, and there is, in my view, largely a single root cause. You can probably guess what my answer to that is. So I think the wicked problem idea is a little tenuous as well. So I want to draw attention to one other point that's very central to the Commission's argument on green transition and its way of conceiving the green transition. It sees the green transition as a growth strategy. And I'm very interested in growth ideology and where it comes from. I'm going to just give you a little précis of my view on economic growth in order to provide some background to this idea, this agenda of the European Commission. So economic growth is an invention. It was invented in Northwest Europe in the mid-17th century. That is my claim. I'm phrasing it a little provocatively, but I don't think economic growth as a concept could have existed before then. I mean, obviously it wasn't dreamt up by individuals in a sense. It emerged through a process, through practices and debates. But if anyone could claim to have been its inventors, the inventors of growth ideology, it would be these lovelies here with their curly, long locks. Ironically, Locke is the least locky of them all, and the one with the loveliest middle name is Barban. I mean, yeah. My parents almost called me Gareth Oliver Dale, and I was due to be born on Christmas Day, but I wish I had a middle name like that. Before these guys, there was no concept of the economy, and there was no way of measuring economic growth. All of this was a product of colonial capitalism. It was capitalist in that only now in the mid-17th century, with so many human people producing for the market in the form of wage labor, and with their products circulating in markets, it was only at this point that people began to conceive of commerce as a field of social regularities, and therefore could see the economy as a law-governed dimension of social life, therefore as something that could grow and grow. So it was a capitalist-born ideology, and it was colonial in a less direct sense. English capitalism at the time was expanding through colonization, as you know, and all of these figures, all of the figures who really designed the growth paradigm, Locke, Northchild, Barban, and so on, all of them were colonial merchants, often with a slave trading interest. But one of them, Petty, was most decisive in growth, in the economic history of growth, because he invented national income accounting, and he did this to assist the English state in its colonization of Ireland, its subjugation of Ireland. And what he and others were doing here was in reinventing inventing political economy as a tool to justify growth. Growth conceived as an abstract quantity, as the wealth of the nation. And this was new. Political economy had never conceived of growth in this way before, hadn't been able to conceive of growth before, really. As this new way of thinking took hold, the use of the word growth, at least in English, was transformed. You can see it in the writings of Josiah Child. He often used growth in the traditional way. What grows in a country, natural produce. But he then began to use it in a more abstract way. The growth and increase of the plantations in Virginia, in Barbados. The growth of trade, he said, to refer to the volume and value of goods. So this was a hinge point in economic thought. Growth, at least in English, shifted from biological particulars to economic abstractions. On the left, you see a biological particular, the growth of a plant. On the right, you see an economic abstraction, the growth of the corn trade. Just as an aside, it's also interesting to see, I think, that the more of this product, the more corn that is grown, the more it turns from a foodstuff for humans to a fuel stuff for cars. So what I'm suggesting then is that growth, in its actual dynamic and in its social construction and in its ideology, all of this is rooted in a particular mode of production, which is capitalist society, because in capitalism, firms are geared to accumulation. The system tends always to value expansion, and if that isn't happening, there is recession and crisis. Growth ideology, I would argue, ranks alongside nationalism as a core ideology of bourgeois rule. Nationalism, which we're all celebrating in its banal form in the Euros at the moment, and so on. So growth ideology is a means of mystification. It's the way in which particular interests are presented as if they are the general interest. It's a way of incorporating the producing classes, the working classes, within a capitalist hegemonic project. Because growth naturalizes the prevailing social order. It therefore justifies it. Growth is seen as natural. Even the symbolism is revealing. If it's discussing an economic field by way of biological analogy, which implies the kind of lovely continuity that we see in biological growth, and a unity. It's the social whole that grows. So in this way, the growth paradigm provides cover for what is the basic goal of capitalist production, which is the self-expansion of capital. Capitalists would much prefer their interests not to be seen in these terms, that they're simply out for the expansion of their business. If the core dynamic of capitalism is presented as growth, this obfuscates and occludes the exploitative process of accumulation. It presents it instead as something for the general interest, for the common good, for all our welfare. So this infinitely expansionary drive of capitalism is given ideological cover through the ideology of growth, and it's inextricable from the treatment of nature as a zone of exploitation, because as competition forces businesses to constantly cheapen their inputs, including the raw materials gained from nature, this forces them to treat nature and workers merely as inputs, as sources of profits, as nothing more than that. This is a critique that has been raised by socialists and anarchists down the centuries. Here's an example from Panakuk. For capitalism, natural resources are basically profit. Nature doesn't serve humanity, but capital, and so on. All right, I've been talking quite a lot about capitalism, so I should elaborate. I'm going to briefly elaborate my terms. My emphasis in defining this system is on social relations of production. So the centrality of wage labor, selling our labor power on markets, and units of capital, so self-expanding value, in competition. So in this definition, I'm not emphasizing economic or legal institutions like market trade or private property. This is the world of left institutionalists like Karl Polanyi, for example. Polanyi was an institutionalist and a Christian. His emphasis is on the market as an institution and the suffering it causes. This contrasts to Marx, whose emphasis is not on markets, it's on capital. That's why he called his main book Capital, not Markets. Now, some of you are going to respond to this and say, how on earth, how can you theorize growth ideology as an ideology of capitalism when it was also a central plank in the ideology of communist societies? And my rejoinder to this is very simple. The Soviet Union and other similar economies, such as the one here for a time, were forms of state capitalism. The late 1920s, in my understanding, was the critical juncture here. It's often thought, late 1920s in Russia, it's often thought of as a time when the political power of the state over the economy was enforced, so a sort of the imposition of politics over economics. But in fact, I argue it was the opposite. This was the time when the Communist Party in Russia became fully economized, an organization dedicated in all its capillaries and membership to the pursuit of economic growth. So what appeared to be a moment of politicization of the economy was in fact the economization of politics. This was the time when industrialization targets were revised sharply upwards. The signal for this was the motto of that came from a Central Committee meeting in 1928, catch up and overtake the West. Donyat and Peronyat, something like this. I don't speak Russian. Competitive growth became a national mantra. In the 1930s, children even named their kids names derived from Donyat and Peronyat. I like to imagine parents who've called their children Donyat and Peronyat, going on a long walk with them and saying, no, catch up. No, no, not you, overtake. Anyway, so if you understand Soviet history and the history of Yugoslavia and so on in this way, and you see Soviet Russia and China as state capitalist, then this will correlate with an understanding of growth ideology as the central ideology of capitalism. And I think it's no coincidence that the first Marxists to identify capitalist modernity as a society of growth fetishism, this concept, the fetishism of growth, came in 1966 from someone who was theorizing Russia as state capitalism. By the way, when I'm in Eastern Europe, I've never quite understood why many people on the left resist seeing Soviet societies in this way. In the late 1980s, I lived in the GDR in East Germany. And like the rest of the East German workforce, I was a wage worker. I freely signed the labor contract. I received my wage into my bank account each month. I was not a slave, or I'm sure I wasn't. I wouldn't have had such wonderful memories of my time there. And I wasn't a serf, but neither did I or my colleagues, any of them, have any say in economic life or political life. There was no collective ownership, as there would be in a socialist society. And in terms of my life experience in East Germany, it was very like life in Britain. Although Britain, in a mix of the 1970s, 1940s, and 1910s. Like Britain in the 1910s, East Germany was not a democracy. Like Britain in the 1940s, East Germany was essentially a war economy, so the government dictated to businesses pretty much what they should do. And like Britain in the 1970s, there was not much unemployment at all. There were lots of council houses and wonderful punk bands, as I recall anyway. So theorizing, what I'm suggesting is that theorizing the Soviet bloc as state capitalist helps us to make sense of economic growth, which is a defining feature of the capitalist system. As ideology and in the dynamics of growth, even business cycles, those dynamics were quite similar in East and West, in North and South. And even today, this concept of state capitalism helps us to make sense of political economy and political ecology. Look at the oil industry. The top 3 firms in the world in the oil industry are all nationalized companies. They're operating under the same constraints of competition and exploitation as private companies. There's no significant difference there. But the experience of the Soviet Union in the interwar period reveals a deeper point too, which is that capitalism is intrinsically an expansionary, globalizing, colonizing system. It penetrates and colonizes oppositional projects. It absorbs them. It transforms them into capitalist forms based on wage labor and competition, as happened to the Soviet Union, which began as an anti-capitalist project and became a state capitalist project, a sort of modernizing counter-revolution of the Stalinist period. I'm not trying to suggest that this makes capitalism a seamlessly successful system that cannot be resisted. There's always resistance. And the overturning of capitalism, its replacement by something better, can only ultimately come from that resistance growing and spreading and interlinking. But we should not kid ourselves that we can drop out of this system or create islands of socialism or anarchism in this or that country or in a cooperative, for example. These are all pulled by the enormous gravitational force of a system that based on the conflict between use value and exchange value, ultimately. Final slide. I'm coming to the end. I haven't covered all the topics I wanted to cover, but I hope I've introduced the summer school by raising some relevant questions. I've been talking a lot about the green transition, but the green transition, when critiqued from the left, is always married, quite rightly, to the idea of the just transition. And the just transition, I think, is a phrase that we must increasingly become a little wary of, as we're wary of all phrases that are publicly debated in this context. I mean, the just transition originated in the last great period of a social movement upturn, the 1960s and early 1970s. The American labor leader, I forget his name, Tony Mazuki, who was a sort of red-green labor leader, I think came up with the term. Anyway, it came from that cauldron of progressive, confident, anti-systemic movements of the 60s and 70s, which hopefully will be repeated soon, although there's not very much sign of it at the moment. But in the view of green liberalism, such as the European Commission view here, what does just transition mean? Well, turning climate challenges into opportunities makes the transition just and inclusive. Hang on. What does this mean here? I mean, what the European Union is doing here is saying that if we can turn the policies and practices required for a net zero economy into market opportunities, basically, then everyone will be included. What this is basically the neoliberal or ordoliberal approach to social policy, which is all about constructing institutions to engineer human economic agents into people who respond, above all, to market opportunities, whose identity is almost defined by their sense of being a market actor. The project is to carve entrepreneurial norms into the grammar of human society. So this is what the European Union proposes. Justice and inclusivity will come from creating business opportunities. I mean, what's included here, again, is the astonishing degree of social polarization we see within Europe, both spatially and above all between classes and worldwide, where the differences are staggering. I mentioned earlier the figure of 2,000 billionaires earning as much as several billion people. I mean, to understand, just as an aside, to understand ethics in today's world, you really need to understand the difference between 1,000 and 1,000,000 and 1,000,000,000. That's a sort of ABC there. So I think there's a real risk that ideas of justice and the just transition could be captured by the agenda of climate delay. Right, I've spoken long enough. I mean, I was given up to an hour, but I've taken 50 minutes, which is longer than I intended. I'm going to, I mean, my initial title was, what's the green transition? Why is it so slow? I think I've covered those a little. Who's behind the backlash? I suggested that it's not a simple liberal conservative issue, but the conservatives are drawing on the society that the liberals have created, that they're intensifying its worship of property and individualism and egotism and so on. And the final question was what on earth to do. I will leave that really for you for the discussion. I mean, what I've been arguing is that really ultimately we do need to be looking to overthrow capitalism, and it may well be that we don't manage that, in which case I think things will begin to look grimmer and grimmer, and we may even end up believing that it was wrong on the part of all the philosophers to see the human species as a valuable experiment. Perhaps we are a blight on this planet. But we, I think, can still hold out hope for social movements to connect together all the billions of people in the world who are incredibly concerned about the future for their children and the future for the natural world. And I think in this regard, the most important strategies under discussion are those of degrowth and the Green New Deal. And there's a lot of, I think, very interesting debate on this question. I've written about it myself, but I won't try your patience by going into these questions at this point, although, of course, if you're interested, we can discuss them in the Q&A. So thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.